Hello, I'm Jose with FrSky North America. In today's video, we're going to do a flap setup. I will go over a few different methods for flaps. So if you are only interested in a particular type of setup, feel free to skip over to the method that you want to use. However, I will be using some interesting concepts, so if you do decide to stick around, you may learn something new that you can use for other things. At the end of this video, I'll also demonstrate how to match your left and right flaps to each other so they move exactly the same throughout the range using the balanced channels feature. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is demonstrate some issues that people have when they do their flap setup. And this is a pretty typical setup. I have my flap switch over here. This is flaps half, this is flaps full. And if you check the servos out over here, this one's representing your flaps, and this one over here is representing your elevator. And if the plane is pointed this way, this would be elevator up, elevator down, and over here is your flaps. Okay, so the first thing is slow down. Obviously, when you move your flap switch, you don't want the servo just to jump there, so you set up a slow down. And a lot of times what happens is they set a slow down, say, of 1 second or 2 seconds, and the servo doesn't move 1 or 2 seconds. So let me show you that. So I'm going to go over here to Model and go to Mixes. And in Mixes, I have a flap setup over here. And this is the canned flap mix that is set up when you do your model wizard. So I'm going to edit it. And over here, if you take a look, I have a slowdown of 2 seconds. So I would assume that if I count 1,000 to 1,000, that should match my count. So let's go ahead and go to the flaps half position. Okay, there it is. And if I go all the way back up and I go to the full position, from up to full, 1,000. Okay, so if you can tell that 2 seconds doesn't seem to mean anything. And I'll show you the problem with it also. Let me demonstrate this. So the problem is this flap setup is set up to use the outputs to set your limits. The order of operation is not quite right to do it in this mode. So what I did to set this up was I put a curve in to limit my flaps. So if you take a look, this is a very, very, very extreme example where I have my flaps up position, like over there, like I don't know what number that is, but we'll say at 10, and then near 50 for my flaps half position, and then like 70 or 80 for my flaps down position. So you can see what it's doing over there. So let me take off this curve. I'm going to go to this curve, and I'm going to take it off. Now, the flap is going to move a lot, but that slowdown now makes sense. 1,000, 2, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 1,000, 2, 1,000. So that's closer to what it is. Now, if you set up your endpoints on this page, your slowdown will not be accurate. But if you set up your endpoints on the output page, then the slowdown will be accurate. And if you take a look, my flap compensation, my elevator compensation, now matches my flap travel. Now, this one over here, I set up a slowdown of 2 seconds for this. When you do your flight mode and you set your fade in and fade out to 1 second, so in other words, half of this number, it'll match. The main problem is when I go from full down all the way to full up, now it's not going to match. This will still take the same amount of time. That stops, and that's still going. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually set up a simple flaps setup that works. Okay, so here we go. I set up a new model, and I did use the model wizard to create this plane, and I did use the flap setup. So when it asked me how many channels for flaps, I said 1 channel for flaps. And this should now be relatively set up. Let's go ahead and go into the model, go to the mixes and take a look. So I've got 1 aileron, 1 elevator on channel 2, and my flaps on channel 5, no source yet. So we're going to go ahead and make the source this switch. And I went in there and edited, and now I'm going to go here to inputs, and I'm going to flip this switch. There it goes. So there's my flaps set up. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is the limited amount of travel that you have in your flaps. The reason why it does that is because down here, the weight is set to 30. And the reason why they do that is because they don't want you to hit the limit. So on your actual flap, in the flap up position, there may be like something that blocks it and limits it, that does not allow that flap to travel higher. And if I had this set to 100% and I flip the switch to the flap up position, you may be burning out your servo. So that's the reason why they limit it to 30%. I'm going to go ahead and crank that up to 100% so we can get the full travel. And what I do when I actually turn on the plane with the flap setup, there's two things you can do. Number one, you can disconnect that connector. The second thing you can do is, which is what I do, which works 99% of the time, is I put the flap switch to the middle position. So that's going to be somewhere in the middle of the travel. Chances are you're not going to bind when you're in that middle position. So with this particular method, let's go ahead and set up a slowdown of 2 seconds. Now, if I was to set up a curve and do my flap limits in the curve, then the 2 second number will not be accurate. But if I get out of this menu, go to outputs over here, and go to my flaps, there's my flaps over here. And then what I can do now is I can set up my limits in here, then I won't have that problem. So again, I am in the middle position. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do my center. So the center would be equal to the half flap position. Let's just say that's it over there. Or maybe right there. Okay, so that's my center position, or my halfway position. The next thing I'm going to do is now I need to do my up position. And obviously, if the direction is backwards, you can invert it over there, the direction from normal to reverse. But what I need to do now is I need to go to the flap up position and adjust that. Probably the safest would be to do the flaps down position first. So if I go to the flaps down position, which is maximum in this particular case, the first thing you want to do is you want to go ahead and bring it down before you actually hit the switch with the model on. And I'll take minimum and I'll bring that down as well. So now I would say it's relatively safe to go to that position over there. The servo didn't move. And then I can go to my max and I can adjust that for more travel. Let's say that that's flaps full right there. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust my minimum travel, which would be my flaps up if I'm not reversed. And I can go back to center, and then I can go to the up position, and then I can adjust this minimum until I can get to the point. So let's just say that that is my flaps up position right there. So now there's my up, my middle, or my half and my full flaps. Okay, let's go ahead and count this. So I'm going to go flaps up, wait until it stops right there. And I had previously I set a 2 second slowdown, 1 1000, 2 1000. There you go, 1 1000, 2 1000. If I go full from one side to the other, 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000, 4 1000. Okay, so now let's go ahead and do a flight mode. So this is the way that most people typically set up their flap to elevator mix. So a lot of planes, like say EDFs, a majority of the EDF scale planes do not require any flap compensation when you're setting it up. They fly fine with flaps half or flaps full, and the plane does not have a tendency to pitch up or down. But a lot of high wing propeller planes do require it. And generally speaking, I'd say the majority of them would require, what happens is when you go to flaps it pitches up. So because it pitches up, we'll need some down trim. What I used to do, I should say, is I used to do it in flight modes. So the first thing you want to do is go into trims and go to your trim elevator. And by the way, some people also like to do a trim aileron as well, so that during the flight mode they can do that. You can do that as well if you want. I'm just going to show you the elevator. But over here is mode. And you want to set it to this, to independent per flight mode. If it's set to easy mode, then it's just a regular trim. But once you flip it over here to independent per flight mode, what happens is now you do have flight modes with independent trims. And now you can set your regular flight mode, which would be your flaps up position, set your trim, and then go to your half flap position and set a different trim with this, and then a different trim over there. So now let's go into flight modes and create some flight modes. So here it is, flight modes, go over there. So right now there's only one flight mode, which is the default flight mode. I'm going to go ahead and add one. And over here, let's name this one half for half flaps. Active condition is when do you want to enable this flight mode? And this is when I flip the half flaps switch, which is in the middle position right there. Okay, the fade in and the fade out is if you do want a bit of slowdown. Now, the way that it works, if I understand this correctly, is a 2-second slowdown is equal to a 1-second fade in and a 1-second fade out. I'm assuming you're fading out of a flight mode at 1 second and fading in on the next flight mode of a second, which would equal 2 seconds. That's my half done. And I'm going to create a new one, add, let's call this one full for full flaps. Active condition is when I move the flap switch to the full position. Same thing. I'll make this 1 second since I did a 2-second slowdown. Okay, I'm going to go back and I'm going to go into the default flight mode and do the same thing, and I'll just make this 1 second and make this 1 second as well. All right, that's it. You set your trim, you go to your trims, and you set your elevator for independent per flight mode, and then you go and you create your flight modes. So we should be set up. So I'm going to go flaps up. Now, you fly your plane, you set your trim. Now you go to the half flap position and you set the trim. And I'm going to exaggerate this. So let's say this is a high wing plane with a propeller, and I'm going to exaggerate this and give it quite a bit. There's my down, maybe about that much. And let's go to full. Max reach. And there it is. So now, if you take a look, if I go over here and go to half flaps, they should move the same amount. And let's confirm that by going to my outputs over here. And over here is my elevator. And over there is my flaps. So they should stop moving at the same time. See that? Perfect. So again, with canned flap mix, you won't have any problems with the slowdown if you do the limits for your flap travel on the outputs. One problem with this setup, so I have it set up, they're timed correctly. The main problem with using flight modes for your flap setup is if I want to go directly from down all the way to up. I'll do it again. This time I'm going to go from flaps up all the way to down. You'll see that the elevator compensation stops, but this continues to move. So the problem with flight modes in this particular case is when you go through from flight modes 1 to flight mode 3, it still has the same amount of slowdown, even though you're going double the amount of positions. So that's why I don't like to use this anymore for my flap to elevator compensation. Okay, so next I'm going to switch over to the way that I do flaps now. Okay, so I switched over to my demo for the way that I set up flaps. And over here, you can see I've got a slowdown on my flaps. There's my flaps up position, my flaps middle position, and my flaps down position. To do my flap to elevator compensation, I am not using a flight mode, I'm using a mix. But it works the same way. So I'm going to flip it to the halfway position. So here's my half flaps. And I can do the same thing. I can go ahead and add some elevator compensation. And then I go into my full, and I can add some more elevator compensation. There it goes. So now, if you take a look, no matter what, these servos will travel the exact same amount. And again, the main problem with using a flight mode to do your flap to elevator compensation is if I go from flight mode 1 all the way to flight mode 3, then the speeds will not match. This will be faster than this. But because I'm doing both of these as mixes and they work exactly the same, and both of these are set to 2 seconds, when I go ahead and do this all the way over from flaps up all the way to flaps down, the timing will be exactly the same. So this now is my preferred method of setting up flaps. It works really good for all situations. And also, since I am not messing with the outputs and I'm doing these as mixes, you can set up your flaps to also run in a different mix that may use the entire range of it, like a full span aileron mix where you make your flaps act like ailerons. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do that setup too. Okay, so I created a model, bound it, and there's my setup right now. And this is a basic model that I set up in the model wizard. But if you take a look, I did not add flaps. And the reason why is I am going to do flaps as a free mix. So let's go ahead and create that. I'm going to go over here, anywhere in here in this list, click in the center over here, enter, and add a new mix. It's going to be a free mix. And I'm going to put it in the last position is fine. And let's go up here and let's name this. So click to go into there, and instead of trying to fumble over there, just go ahead and hit the center button over here, the page button, and when you're in text edit mode, it becomes delete. Okay, so I'm going to call this mix flaps. There it goes. Return to get out of it. Source, let's go ahead and make it the switch. Be very careful because your flaps, if the actual flaps on the plane is a scale plane, it may have an up travel limit. In other words, the flap will not go mechanically any more than its up position. So you want to be very careful when you set up your flaps because of that. But let's go ahead and do that. So let's just say right now that this servo over here is my flaps. And I'm going to go ahead and assign it a source, and the source is a switch. There it is. And I'm going to go ahead and assign it a channel. So when you do this, if your model is on, you either disconnect the linkage so that your flap may not hit the extreme, or what I do, I'll be honest, is I leave my linkages connected, but I just make sure I'm in the middle mode, so I'm at the 0 center point of the servo, which chances are is not going to bind on the edges. So I'm going to go ahead and assign channel 5 to it. Yes. And I believe that now there it is, right? So again, don't do that to test it. If you do have your plane hooked up and the linkage is hooked up, just put it in the middle position. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do my limits of my flap travel. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to add a curve. The curve that I want to do is going to be add a curve, and let's name it flap limit. And what I've been doing recently, oh, that didn't do the M, whoops. What I was about to say was what I do now is after I name something, the last items I put is like, say, CV, so I know that this is a curve. When you're looking through things that you made, that might save you. Okay, the type is going to be a custom curve, and I only need 3 points since it's flaps up, flaps middle, or flaps half, and flaps full. Now over here in the points adjustment is how I adjust my limits. So now all 3 points, if you take a look on your list over here, are set to 0. So now I'm free to go ahead and move that up and down. So let's go to the flap up position, go over here, and then now I'm going to go ahead and adjust my flaps. And actually in this case, I'm going to do it like this, where the flap is exactly there, like that. And then my point 2 will be my flap half position, so I'll move my switch to the half position. And now I'll go ahead and adjust it to what I think would be a good half, like say somewhere around there. And then flap position 3, which is my flaps down position, I'm going to go ahead and adjust that to a good down amount. And say there, doesn't really matter. So now I've got my flaps half, my flaps up, and my flaps full. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and go over here. I'm going to add a new action, and let's do our slow down. There's my slow. Same thing, let's set it to 2 seconds. Now let's take a look. 1/1000. Oh, no, what the heck? Even the full 1/1000 to not even 2 seconds on the full. And the reason why is because we are much smaller than what the actual full range of the thing is. But if you come over here and take your slow and put it on top of the curve, so it's the order of operation. I'm going to go ahead and move this, and I'm going to move it all the way to the top. Now, let's go ahead and move this 1/1000, 2/1000, 1/1000, 2/1000. And if I go all the way from one extreme to the other, 1/1000, 2/1000, 3/1000, 4/1000. There it is. So now we have an accurate number that we know. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make an elevator compensation for flaps. This is going to get a little bit confusing, so bear with me, but I swear to you, it is a great way to set up your flaps. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go over, get out of this menu, and go over here to VARs. Now, some people may know this, and a lot of people won't know this, but there's a new thing in VARs called repurpose trim. And what repurpose trim does is it allows you to use the same trim button for another function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 2 VARs, one of them for the half flap position and then one of them for the full flap position. And I'm going to repurpose the trim to not use as a trim, even though it kind of will be a trim. But I'm going to go over here. Actually, let's name it first. And I'm going to name this half. Let's just to make it a little bit less, make it more compact. Let's call it half TRM VAR. So this is going to be the half flap trim VAR. I'm going to go down here and add a new action. Now, when is this VAR active? When I hit this switch over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to the bottom to repurpose, and I'm going to repurpose the trim elevator. And the steps, this is how, like the steps when you hit that, the trim, I'm just going to make it 0.2. Doesn't really matter. It's like if you want it to be rougher, you can make it 0.5, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I'm set up with this, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to add one more VAR, add, and let's call this one full, FLL, trim VAR. So full, full flaps, trim VAR. And same thing, I'm going to go down here at the bottom, add a new action, and this is going to be in the full flap mode. And over here, I want to go over to repurpose, trim elevator, and same thing, make the steps 0.2. So now I've got a half trim var and a full trim var. And what I'm doing is when I activate those modes, so when I'm up here, this trim will be normal. When I flip to this mode, this trim is no longer your elevator trim. It is now this half trim var. And when I go to full mode, same thing, this trim is no longer elevator trim or the half trim var, but it's actually the full trim var. So this elevator trim became 3 separate trims. Now, I'm going to use it to affect the elevator, but in a different way that's a little bit unique. So now, I'm going to go back into the model, go into the mixes. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and create the elevator to flat mix. So my elevator's there and it works just fine. So I'm going to go over here and add a new free mix. And I'm going to put it right after elevators so I know that it affects the elevators. And I'm going to call this one, delete, delete, delete. And I'm going to call this FLP, the number 2, space L, flap to elevator. Okay. And the source for this is going to be this trim switch or the flap switch. There it is, SB. And I'm going to go ahead and add a curve to this. So let's go ahead and add a curve. And this is what's going to control the amount of elevator compensation I have is this curve. So the curve that I want is going to be, let's add a new one. And this is going to be FLP to elevator curve. Flap to elevator curve. Enter. The type of curve that I want is going to be a custom curve with 3 points. In the points config, the first point will be 0. So in other words, when the switch is in the up position, it will be 0. In other words, no compensation, nothing. And then when I go to the middle position, it'll be that point. And then I go to the third position, it'll be that point. So you can see it over there. There's my up position. And then this one controls my elevator compensation when I'm in a half flat position. And then this one over here controls my elevator compensation when I'm in a full position. So the first point is 0, no compensation. Second point, instead of adding a number, I'm going to use a source. And the source that I want to use is that var that we created. It's the half var that we created. There it is. And then over here, use a source. And this is going to be another var. And it'll be the full trim var that we created. So now, I forgot one thing. Go to flap to elevator mix and assign it a channel, an output. And the output's going to be elevator. So with the switch up, it does nothing. It's still, your elevator still works just fine. With the switch down or to the middle position, right now it still works fine, and here it works fine. But now, so if I go to the half lap position, now I have this trim is now moving that curve 0.2 up and down. There's up, and there's elevator down. Okay, so if I go to flaps down, now I can give it more. There's more down. There you go. So the only thing I have to do now is add a new action over here, add a slowdown, the same amount that I have in my flaps. So in this case, we're going to go, I think I did 2 seconds. I don't remember anymore, but let's just try it. But whatever you have in your flaps, you do the same thing here. 1 1,000, 2 1,000. Oh, wait, it didn't work. Look at how slow or how much, how quickly that went. Same thing. It's order of operation. If we put this slowdown at the top of the list, so move it to the top of the list, the order of operation changes, and now I've got 1 1,000, 2 1,000. There you go. So if I go over to flaps, edit, 2.1. I made a mistake there. So I must have put 2.1 instead of 2. There, we're turning it out of it. And then now they should exactly match. So if you match the numbers, have the slow in the top of the actions, then this will work just fine. There you go. So again, the limitation in a flight mode is if I was to push a switch from all the way down and go full up, all the way up, then this will stop before this one. But if I go ahead and do it in this mix, the timing is exactly the same. Okay, so I showed you how to do a simple flap setup using flight modes and the canned flap mix that is set up when you do your model wizard. So the second method I showed you was using a switch again and not using the canned flap mix and just creating a free mix, which allows you to change the order of operations to make the slowdown work the way that we want it to. Now, the third method is exactly the same as this one, except I'm going to do a slider. So I'll use this slider to set it up. It's the same thing, but because I'm using a slider, there's one more level of complexity in it. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up from scratch again, and so that we can just go all the way through it. A lot of the steps are the same as this one with a couple of added stuff. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so here's my basic setup. There's my elevator, and this will represent my flap. As you can tell, I did not use the model wizard to create a flap mix. I'm going to create one using a free mix. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to go over here, and anywhere in the list, hit add. Go to free mix, and go to last position is fine. And let's go ahead and name this. So I'm going to hit here to delete the characters. F, L, P. Let's make it full. So there's flaps. Enter. And then now active condition always on. Let's set a source, and the source is going to be a slider. So this version is going to be the slider version of doing flaps. And this is the way that I do it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a channel output. Now in this particular case, my receiver's on and my flaps are on, but because there's nothing assigned right now, it's not assigned to a channel, this flap is actually inactive. So be very careful when you go ahead and activate it. One of the best things you can do is you can disconnect your push rod from your servo or to your surface of your flaps, because a lot of flaps, when it goes to the up position, there's actually a mechanical stop that doesn't allow it to go farther. And if your servo travels more than that mechanical stop, you might burn out your servo. So be very careful when you do this. You can either disconnect the linkages. I'll tell you, I'll be very honest, I don't. What I usually do is I put my flaps to the middle position, because generally speaking, the middle position is a safe position. But do that at your own risk. So I'm going to go ahead and assign it to channel 5, which is flaps. Now, if I kind of move this, I can see that it works. So the first thing you want to do is confirm that your reversing is correct. So this should be up and it's down. One of the things you can do, you can either reverse a channel, or in a slider's case, I'll just reverse that slider. So that slider right now, slider left, the direction it is going is what it thinks is right, but I'm going to go ahead, hit here. Let's do that again. I want to make sure that you guys understand what I'm doing. Let's go over here and hit and hold down. Negative. So now, if you take a look, slider left, and it's got a minus symbol, that means it's backwards. So now that is my up position, which is correct, and that's my down position. Okay, so now let's go ahead and limit this to the proper movement. So what I like to do, again, if your servos are hooked up, be very careful, because you may be hitting a stop, a limit. and you may burn out your servos. But I'm going to go over here and go add a new action. And then over here, I'm going to choose a curve. So a curve is what I'm going to use to limit my travel. I don't do it on outputs because, like, let's say in this particular case, this flap can go up past its up position. So the flap can actually go farther up and farther down. And I might decide to use a flap mix that does full span ailerons. In other words, I'm using my flaps as part of the ailerons as well. So you can do that kind of stuff. But let's go ahead and add. And now I'm doing it in the curve. Let's name this FLP limit. Keep forgetting that M, or I keep missing that M, I should say. There it is. And type is going to be a custom. And the number of points that I want is 3 for flaps up, flaps middle or half, and flaps full. Okay, so now I'm going to use this curve to adjust my flap limits. So I'm going to come over here, and if I move over here to 0.1, once I'm at 0.1, that is flaps up, and I can go over here and adjust this until I am at flaps up. So let's just say that flaps full up is over there. Let's make it like that. I don't know, it doesn't really matter. And then my half flaps position, let's go ahead and now notice I'm adjusting it's not moving the servo because I got to actually go to the flap half position. And I'm going to say that's going to be flaps half right there. And let's go to flaps full and do the same thing. Go to flaps full and adjust that till I am in my full. And then now I can take a look. There's half, there's up, and there's no binding in the up position. The half position's half, and there's my full. Okay, so we set this up. That's it. So that's it. There's my flaps on a slider. And if I want, I can add a slowdown as well in here, and maybe I will do it later on. But for now, let's just say that's it. Now we're going to go ahead and set up the flap to elevator mix. And notice I said mix and not a flight mode. If you're going to do flaps on a slider, you don't want, so a flight mode is a particular position, so a particular switch hit. So like something to go into that flight mode, and it's not linear. So if I do a flight mode, then the flight mode activates when I'm in the half position, but in between here and here, it doesn't move that. So a flight mode will not work in this particular mode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it as a mix. So I'm going to come out of here, and let's go ahead and create a new mix. So anywhere in this list, hit enter and add a new free mix. And I'm going to put it right after elevator, so because it does affect the elevator. And let's name it FLP to EL flap to elevator. Okay, active condition is always on. Source is going to be the slider. And the output is going to be channel 2, which is your elevator. So now I have this flap also controlling my elevator. And of course, we want to limit it to just the amount that we need for the elevator compensation when I hit my flaps. Right now, it's the entire range. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go out of here, and I'm going to go to a logic switch, and I'm going to create a logic switch so that I can identify the flaps up position, the half position, and the full position. What we really need is the half and the full position, but we might as well create 3 logical switches, and that way we can actually put sounds on there that say flaps up, flaps half, and flaps full. But we're going to create a logic switch so that this slider then becomes something that I can put a logic switch to. So I'm going to go over here, and let's name this one FL up LS for logic switch. And the function that I want is going to be an A is greater than X. Source will be this slider, and the value is going to be, I'm going to come up with, I'm going to say about 70. So what I need to do is identify when I'm pretty close to or at the flaps up position. So this is flaps up, and if I do A is greater than X and A is greater than 70, when A is greater than 70 on the slider left, you see that that turns on. Okay, that's my logical switch set up. And the next thing I'm going to do is I can create another logical switch for the middle position, so which is that flaps half position. I'm going to go over here, let's name it, and FLP HF half LS for a logical switch. You don't have to call it that. You can call it whatever you want, but I like calling it LS so I know that it's a logical switch when I look at a list. And this one, instead of A is greater than or less than, I'm going to do range. So same thing, choose slider left for my source, and the range is going to be, say, positive or minus or positive, doesn't really matter, just do the opposite on the other side, maybe 30% to positive 30%. So I have a good range where it'll trigger to identify that the flaps is in the half position. Now, I forgot to do this on the other one, so I'm going to do it on this one. I'm going to go back and do it. I do a delay before active and a delay before inactive of 0.2 seconds whenever I'm doing something for a switch or for a slider. So what it's doing is if there's a little bit of dither or a little bit of noise in there, it'll filter it out so you won't hear flaps half, flap half, like it won't keep triggering that over and over and over again. So let's go back up here. Let's add that 0.2 seconds. There it is. Okay, so let's add one more for the flaps down position. Add. And let's name this FLPDN for flaps down switch, so logical switch. And this can be A is less than X. The source is going to be the slider. And the value is going to be down here at, say, I think 70 is a good number, 70 or 60. There it goes. So once I get past that point, then it'll trigger that switch. Let's take a look at all three logical switches right there. So logical switch 1 is my flaps up, and it'll trigger when I'm pretty close to all the way. And the half flaps one will trigger once I'm close to the middle position, and the down logical switch will trigger when I'm there. So now we can use these as special in special functions to trigger a flaps half, a flaps down, and a flaps full sound effect if I want it. In this case, I'm actually going to only use the half and the full logical switch to trigger when I'm in that mode to adjust something. So the next thing I'm going to do, this is a little bit weird, I'm going to go to VARs. And I added a new VAR, and here, let's go ahead and name it. And this is going to be the half flaps trim VAR. So a half trim VAR. And down here at actions, I'm going to go ahead and add a new action. And this particular one over here is when does this particular mode happen? And this happens when that logic switch that we created is in the half position. So there's my half logical switch. And what I'm going to do is not add, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and repurpose the elevator trim. So in other words, when this is triggered, so when I'm in the half position, this will no longer be my elevator trim, but it'll be something else. It'll be this far. And I'm going to change this to, say, 0.2, so I have a little bit of fine tuning. And I'm going to get out of this, and there it is, my half trim VAR. I'm going to go ahead and add a new one over here. And let's name it FL for full trim var. And this one over here, we're going to do the exact same thing. Let's add a new action. And when do I want to trigger? I want to trigger when my logic switch for my flaps in a down position gets triggered. So now it'll turn on when that logic switch. And same thing, let's go ahead and go over here and make it a repurpose trim elevator. And we'll make it 0.2 so you get a little bit of resolution. And that's it. So I've got my half trim var and my full trim var. And now we're going to use it. So I'm going to get out of here, go back to mixes, and go to that flap to elevator mix. Whoops, the wrong one. That one over there, and edit. Okay. So now notice how when I move the slider, this is moving. Okay. So now let's add a new action over here. And let's go ahead and change this action to curve. And the curve that we want to do, we want to add a new curve. And I'm going to call this FLP for flap to EL for elevator. Flap to elevator, I'm going to call it trim. Enter. And the type that I want is a custom 3-pointer, only 3 points, because we just want the 3 different positions for the flaps up, flaps, and down. Okay, one thing I noticed here is it's working backwards from the way that I want it to, because I want this to be up and I want it to be on that side. So I'm going to go back, first of all, and go over to the slider over here. I forgot to make that in negative. So now my slider is backwards, my mix is still the same. Okay, now I'm going to go back here to this over here, edit, and edit this curve again. Now, yeah, this is the way that I want it to work. So over here, that's flaps up, this is flaps middle, and here's flaps down. 3 points in your custom. And now let's go to the points. Okay, and again, this is we're doing a flap to elevator compensation. So my first point, I'm going to leave at 0. My second point, instead of having a number, I'm going to use a source. And the source that I want to use is that var that we created. And it's the var that's the half trim var. And then on point 3, which is the flaps in the full position, same thing, use a source, and this time the full trim var. So vars, and over here, and full. So the best way to describe this, I'm going to go back out of here, and we're going to take a look over here. So I'm going to go flaps up, and your trim will work normally for your elevator. So there's my trim. If I want to add trim, it's working normally. Nothing's happening over there, right? But there's my trim. Go back to center. Now, when I go down here to the half position, what's happening is now that half position curve point is adjustable by this trim because I used that var to create it. So here it is. Here's my down trim over here. And then now, if I go to full over there, I can give it more down trim. That's a lot, but it's just an example. You're never going to use that much trim. But now, guess what? This and this are tied together because they are both using mixes. They'll always be the same speed. And even with this setup, if you wanted to, you can add a slowdown to smooth out the motion in here. So I'm going to go ahead and add a slowdown to this flap to elevator mix. And let's go ahead and do a slow. And let's make it 1 second. So again, this is on the flap to elevator mix, so this will affect the elevator. Okay, now it doesn't seem like it's doing much. Why? Same problem that we had before. Is since we're only using a portion of the mix, then, or yeah, a portion of the range, if we move this to the top, because of order of operation, there it goes. There's my 1 second movement. So I like using a little bit of slowdown, even if I'm on a slider, just to smooth it out a little bit. And there's 1 second. So the only thing we got to do is put that same 1 second slowdown on my flat mix. And again, if you use the canned flat mix, you cannot change order of operation. And because you can't change that, you can't slow it down to the proper amount. So again, I'm in a free mix and I added a new action. I'm going to do a slow. Let me make it 1 second. And I'm going to move it to the top. So now there's my full flaps, and there's my half flaps, and there's my flaps up. And if you notice, my flaps and my elevator, no matter what, even though I added speed, because I added the same speed, they're going to be exactly in line. So again, if you add a slowdown and use the canned mix, so if you add a slowdown in the canned flap mix, you are limited. If you want that number to, represent something real, you're limited to doing any of your endpoint adjustments for your flaps to the output. But if you do it with your own mix that you create and you have these actions, it works beautifully. Hey guys, I was just about to publish this video when I realized that not everybody does things the same way that I do. Personally, when I set up my flap to elevator mix, I don't do any aileron trim compensation, and I try to rely on making the flaps as even as possible. And I understand that that's not necessarily realistic for a lot of people with their setups. So I figured I'll also show how to add some aileron to flap compensation as well. Now, it's exactly the same thing, so let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to do this with the switch version, and I'll sort of like say what the differences are for the slider version if you want to do this for the slider version too, but it's essentially the same thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the elevator to flap mix that I created, and I'm just going to duplicate it. So I'm going to clone it. And then I'll edit it, and let's go ahead and call this one Aileron. Whoops. Aileron to flap. Source again is SB. And at the bottom, instead of going to the elevator channel, we want to go to the Aileron channel. Now, if this message pops up, channel 2 and channel 1, I don't want to swap settings. So if there's on the outputs, if there's reverses or anything like that, you don't want to do that. What it's asking for is, are you actually changing this to, an aileron channel because it used to be an elevator? No, I am just adding a mix. So I go to ailerons and I choose no if you get that warning. Now, the other thing that we have to change, so all this stuff will remain exactly the same. The only thing you have to change now on this new aileron to flap mix is this curve. So we don't want to use this curve. So I'm just going to go ahead and go over here, and instead of using that curve, I'm going to add a new curve, and let's call this one curve. So it's the aileron to flap curve, and now I'm going to go ahead and do another custom. Same thing, 3 points, exactly the same. And same thing that we're going to do as we did for the elevator to flap curve is we're going to add vars in here to adjust these points for us as we hit the trim switch. But what we need to do is we need to create those vars first. So I'm going to back out of this, and I'm going to go over to vars. And we can copy these, but I mean, it's so simple. I'm just going to create new ones. So I called this full and half flap trim var. I should have probably called it, elevator flap trim var, but I'm just going to do that now for the next ones, because this one is elevator, and since I'm adding an aileron version, I should have called it something with elevator, but I'm going to do that now. So the name on this is going to be Aileron. Actually, let's call it full or half. Let's do half first. Half aileron trim var. Add a new action, half position, and instead it's going to be a repurpose of a trim, and this time we're going to repurpose the aileron trim. Do the same thing. Let's do the steps at point 2. Now, if this was the slider version, then you would just use that same logical switch that you had for the half position, and you'd put that in there. So you choose logical switch, and it would be the half logical switch, and you just choose it. You don't have to create a new logical switch. You can use the same one that you used before, and then everything else is the same. So now let's create another new one, and I'm going to go over here and call this full aileron trim var. Okay, oops, edit. And then I'm going to come over here and add a new action. Same thing. We're going to go to the full switch position, repurpose trim, and we're going to trim aileron. So we're going to repurpose the trim aileron. So when this switch is in a down position, then trim aileron will no longer trim aileron. It'll be this var, if that makes any sense. And then I'm going to go over here and make that a 0.2. So I'm making this the same as the other ones. And now we can actually test it on this page. So right now the values are all at 0. And if I go over here to up position, nothing will change. So if I hit my aileron, nothing will change because it is an aileron trim. But if I go to the half, then the half aileron one should now change its value. And I'll keep a value in there, see 0.6. And if you notice, that is persistent. And now I can put more once I flip this to the down position, and I can do a different one over there. So this trim effectively became 3 different trims. It'll be the aileron trim, it'll be the aileron half trim var, and it'll also be the full aileron trim var. And the elevator works the same way. So now I'm going to go back to that mix, and I want the aileron to flap mix. Edit. I'm going to go over here to this curve, edit, and then we'll edit it over here. Now we can also go directly to the curve menu and just edit it from there, but since we're here, might as well just do it this way. So I go over here to points, and I go to 0.2, and again I hit and hold down. I use a source, and then now I can hit again, and now I choose var, and I'll look for the aileron half var, put that in there, and here's the full. Hit and hold down, use a source, and then I choose var again, and this time I choose the full aileron trim var. So now, if I go up over here, nothing will happen over here. But so if I go ahead and move the trim, right now it's aileron trim, so it's not affecting this curve in any way. Let me go back to center. Okay, and then if I go to the half position, now since this half aileron trim var controls that, and now it's adjusting. And I go to the full position, and it'll adjust that as well. I'll go back and I'll just put this back to center. But that's it. So let's go ahead and take a look at my outputs and just make sure that this all works the way that we think it works. I go to my outputs and I'm going to go ahead and take a look at my elevator, my aileron, which is the two on top, and my flaps. So my flap position over there, and right now everything is zeroed. Let's go flaps up all the way. And while I'm in flaps up, I can adjust my elevator trim. And there's my trim for my elevator changing. I can adjust my ailerons just like normal. Once I go to the half flap position, then my elevator trim no longer trims my elevator, but it actually adjusts the curve, the half point of the curve, which does adjust the elevator. There it goes. And then let's give it some aileron as well. Let's go the other direction. Wrong way. Let's go the other direction just so that we can see a big change. There. And at full, let's give it more on the elevator. And more on, on the aileron and more on the elevator. So let's take a look really quick. There's my full, my half, and everything is moving as one, and my off. All right, so there you go. So again, you can do this for elevator and aileron, and you also can do this in the slider mode. All you gotta do is assign in the var, you need to assign your logic switch that you created to those vars. All right, that's it, guys. Okay, so the next thing that we're gonna look at is balancing channels. So in this example, since we're doing flaps, we're going to do it with flaps. Let's pretend that this servo represents the left flap and this servo over here represents the right flap. And what you want is you want them to be the same all the way through the range. So the first step, obviously, is to mechanically adjust the linkages to be as close as possible. So make sure that the servo arms are at the same position and that the linkages are adjusted as close as possible to each other. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to double check, and you'll notice that, wait a second, yeah, okay, that one may be a little bit off from this one. And of course, you would measure your flaps to find that out. So let's go to the mixes. And for this example, I just got rid of everything else and just have the flap mix. I'm going to go into that and edit. And over here is your weight. So I limited it down. Let's maybe change that. Let's make it maybe 80%. So let's say I limited my flap travel, like maybe I did it with a curve or whatever, but that's just an example of limiting it so that it's not the entire full throw. And that's going to play into something in here later on, so you'll see that. Okay. So we have our flaps adjusted, and let's just say that we use this one as the master, and then this one's just a little bit off from the other one, from that one. So I'm going to get out of this, and I'm now going to go into the output screen. So here in outputs, go over to outputs, pick a channel. So one of the channels that we have is flaps on channel 5. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to go down to the bottom, and you've got an option here called balance channels. So over here, what channels do you want to balance? So 5 is hit because that's what you selected. But I'm going to go over here and add channel 6 and then hit OK. So over here, notice you can't hit OK. Just go page, or you can just hit OK down there. I prefer to use this. I find it more precise. Now I can hit OK. So now if we look over here, there's our 2 channels, and now we can adjust the points. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create the number of points that we want. So over here is the gear icon. And same thing, I can either click on it or just go over the gear icon and hit enter. And you can change the number of points. So think of this as a curve, except now you're dealing with 2 channels and matching between the 2. So let's make this 12 points, for example. So you can pick the number, and then you can choose smooth or not smooth. I would actually do measurements and double check in between and make sure that it's good. You may want smooth, you may not. So I'm going to get out of this. I'm going to hit OK. And then now there are all my points. So the first thing that we have is, since we have a switch, so I purposely assigned this not to a slider but to a switch, because I've only got 3 points I can actually go to right now. So the first item over here, that one over there, if I click on that, if I choose a rotary knob, or say this slider, I'll choose this slider over here, then it temporarily assigns it away from the switch and chooses the slider. So now I can go to each one of those points and then adjust it. So since we're on a slider, we can now go anywhere in the range. Be careful if you have your flaps hooked up, because notice that when I'm going to get that out for a second. So now we're back to a switch. Notice we're not going all the way to the ends anymore, because remember, we limited it down to 80%. Or say you have, like, your flap limit set. So this is the entire range of travel, but I'm only using that much. When I hit this and I change it over to a slider, you have the ability to go past that point now. So just be careful when you're using a slider not to go past that point. All right, so now we have all these points. What I would do is I would pick a point, like say that point over there, and you pick a channel. So let's say this is my master. Then on this one over here, I'll just balance it to that. So I'll actually do a physical measurement and measure my flaps and make sure that it's the same number. If it's not the same number, then I can come back here to this side over here, and then notice the center one. So if I move the scroll wheel, the center one will move. I want that one that's closest to where my line is to move. So I can just go System over to that one. And then now I can adjust this up and down. And this is a very fine adjustment. If you can see it move up and down to try to get that closer to each other. So let's just say I need a little bit of up there. Okay. Then I can go forward in the thing and go to the next point. One of the things that may help you is that down there. So I'm going to hit return to get out of that mode, jog over to here. And what this will do is whatever point you're nearest is what it will select. So if I go forward again, or I'm sorry, backwards again, go back to here, hit enter, and then notice how that one's already highlighted. If I go to the next point, see how that turned yellow or orange, I guess? I don't know if it's yellow or orange. So that's the one that will be turned or will be adjusted when you turn your scroll wheel. So I can come over here to this one over here, then adjust this up and down until it's good. Let's say there, I don't know. And then go to the next point, and then go up and down and adjust that until it's good. Go over here and adjust that up and down. So essentially, in between those adjustments, I'm measuring to make sure that this and this are now matching in measurement. So you can continue to adjust, and then now, as you go through that travel, it should adjust it. Now, again, you may want to, if you wanted to, you may want to, let's say, go over here, make it less points or more points, and you may want to turn on or off that smooth. But I would turn it on, double check, turn it off, double check. So that's essentially how you do a balance. So I'm going to hit OK to get out of this, and then I can move around. Let's actually go back. So I'm going to go back and highlight this. So this is the one I'm working on. And then when I hit enter, then as I move this slider over there, as I move it, then that's the one that I adjust. That point I adjust. So I'm getting this closer and closer and closer till they're as close as possible to each other. I hope that makes sense. Okay, once you're done with this, then you can return to get out of the adjustment mode, go forward, and I'm going to take this and take it back and make it a switch again. And then now I'm back to normal, and they should be matching because I've sat there and I've measured all those points and made sure that they were balanced within each other. So I hope this makes sense. Now, once you get out of this all the way, you'll notice that in your output, a new balance curve showed up. So this balance curve is for channel 5, and if you look over here, you don't see much change. But if I go over to channel 6, where I made my adjustments, that created a balance curve, and you can see it's got the up and down that I created. So again, you can create as many points, up to 21 points as you want, and you can go to each of those points by using a slider, and you can adjust the points to try to get this and this closer to each other. And that's it. So those, if you look over here on your outputs, and you've got the, let me get out of that again. You got the balance icon. It tells you that these channels have been modified and balanced. So you have a balance between those two. That's it, guys. I think that's enough. We did a bunch of different flap setups, and we also showed you how to balance channels. You can also use this to balance on some planes where you have like big planes where you have 2 servos per aileron surface. You can use this method to also balance between the 2 channels to make sure that they're right. Now, the process would be different. You would want to disconnect one and then try to adjust it so that it's exactly right on the money, and then reconnect it back up again. But I think if you guys are doing that, you understand how that works. But now with the balance feature in this radio, it's just made it a lot more powerful, a lot more easy to use. That's it, guys. I think I'm done with flaps. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email me at Jose@FrSky, which is FrSky-RC.com. Or leave a comment in this video. And if you guys have any ideas of anything that you want me to do a video on, just go ahead and let me know, and I'll see if I can get to it. Thank you very much, guys, and have a good night.